What would you do if you had nothing left but the clothes on your back and $4 to your name? What if the only thing you could afford was a place the rest of the world had agreed to forget? A place sealed and silent for a decade. For Ida Whitcomb, a 25-year-old laundrywoman in the raw, dust-choked heart of 1880s California, this wasn't a question. It was the hard reality of a Tuesday afternoon. She bought a locked Chinese temple for $4, a place rumored to hold nothing but fever and ghosts. The only property at the county auction no one would even look at. But the truth waiting inside those sealed doors had little to do with sickness and everything to do with the silence the town had paid dearly to keep. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, song as we tell a story about the things we throw away and the secrets they keep. Ida stood at the back of the small crowd gathered in front of the livery stable. The auctioneer's voice was a practiced drone, selling off parcels of land, unclaimed freight, and the paltry belongings of people who had either died or disappeared. She kept her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn apron, the fabric thin and smelling faintly of lye soap and sunshine, the last remnants of a life that had ended that morning. Her employer, Mrs. Gable, had told her plainly, "Times are hard, Ida. I can't afford the help." There was no malice in it, just the flat, unpitying truth of their world. So Ida had packed her few things in a flour sack, collected her final wages, and walked away from the only home she'd known for 3 years. Though the $4 silver in her pocket felt both impossibly heavy and terrifyingly light. She had watched as a good horse sold for $60, a barren quarter-acre for $20, a set of carpenter's tools for $8. Everything was beyond her. She was just waiting, she supposed, for the auction to end so the crowd would disperse and she could find a corner to be alone with the rising panic in her chest. Then the auctioneer, a man named Henderson with a stained vest and a booming voice, cleared his throat. "All right, last lot of the day. Property at the east edge of town, known as the Old Joss House, deed number 734. A murmur went through the crowd, a rustle of discomfort. Men shuffled their feet. Women pulled their shawls a little tighter. No one stepped forward. Ida looked toward the east, where the road dissolved into dry plains. She knew the building. A strange, tiered roof and faded paint, visible from the edge of town like a forgotten monument. "It's been sealed 10 years, Henderson continued, his voice losing some of its bluster. "Sold as is, where is. County takes no responsibility for its contents or condition. Do I have an opening bid? Let's say $10? Silence. The wind kicked up a swirl of dust that danced between the unmoving boots of the ranchers and merchants. $5? Henderson asked, a note of pleading in his tone. He looked around, meeting no one's eye. The property was a dead weight on the county books, a place everyone wanted gone but no one would touch. A memory of her father's voice, a low rumble from a long time ago, surfaced in her mind. "There's no such thing as worthless, Ida, and just things folks ain't got the patience to understand." $1, a man near the front snickered, and a few others laughed with him. It was a joke. Henderson's face tightened. "This is a legal auction, gentlemen." He scanned the crowd one last time, his gaze passing over Ida without seeing her. She felt a strange impulse, a pull not of logic, but of desperation. She had $4. If she spent them, she would have nothing, but she already had nothing. What she didn't have was a roof for the night. This place, whatever it was, had one. She took a breath, the dust sharp in her throat. $4, she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the thick silence it carried like a shout. Every head turned. The laughter died. People stared at her. The laundry girl, the one Mrs. Gable let go. They saw her plain dress, her tired face, and the absurdity of her bid. Henderson blinked, genuinely surprised. $4 from the young lady in the back? Do I hear 5? He didn't wait long. He knew there would be no other bids. Going once, going twice. Sold. The gavel fell with a crack that felt like the breaking of a spell. To Miss Ida Whitcomb for $4. The crowd began to break apart, their whispers following her as she walked forward, a low hiss of pity and suspicion. Fever house. Bad luck. What's a woman like her want with a place like that? She ignored them, her face a calm mask, and handed her $4 silver to the clerk. In return, he gave her a folded deed and a single, heavy iron key, its surface pitted with rust. The key was cold in her palm, a piece of dead, unyielding metal. It was the key to a place no one wanted, so it's a place of secrets and sorrow. It was the only thing in the world she owned. The walk to the edge of town was short, but it felt like a pilgrimage. With each step, the sounds of Prosperity Wells, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rattle of wagons, the distant shouts of children, faded behind her, replaced by the low moan of the wind across the open plain. The temple stood on a slight rise, set back from the road as if it had tried to retreat from the town that had forsaken it. The setting sun bled across the sky, casting the building in hues of bruised purple and soft, melancholic orange. It was larger than she had remembered, with a swooping, tiered roofline that seemed more suited to a storybook than to the hardscrabble landscape of California. The paint, once a vibrant red and gold, had been scoured by a decade of sun and wind, leaving behind a pale, ghostly shell. Weeds choked the small yard, and a single, skeletal tree clawed at the sky beside it. The front doors were massive, made of thick, dark wood, and barred shut with heavy planks of timber nailed across them. A paper talisman, its calligraphy faded to an illegible gray smudge, was tacked to the center, fluttering weakly in the breeze. It was a place that didn't just feel abandoned, it felt imprisoned. The town's fear was a physical presence here, a palpable weight in the air. Ida clutched the deed in her hand, the paper a flimsy proof of ownership against the building's profound and sorrowful silence. She had bought a building, but it felt more like she had acquired a tombstone. It looked exactly as worthless as the $4 she'd paid for it. Her heart, which had been buoyed by the strange, defiant act of the purchase, now sank with the sun. This was a mistake, a fool's purchase made by a desperate woman. What had she been thinking? The whispers of the townspeople returned to her. Fever house. They said a terrible sickness had swept through the Chinese community that had built it, leaving no one alive. The county marshal, they said, had sealed it himself to keep the contagion from spreading. It was a clean, simple story. A tragedy, but one that was safely in the past. Ida stood before the barred doors, the heavy iron key useless in her pocket, and felt the full weight of her isolation settle upon her. She had traded all she had for a pile of decaying wood and bad memories. Was this the end of Ida's road, or just the beginning? What secret was so terrible it had to be nailed shut behind these doors? Let us know what you think she'll find inside, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history. Now, as the last light faded, Ida had to face her first night as a property owner, with nothing but a locked door between her and the unknown. The mockery began before she had even left the auction. It was a low tide of whispers and sideways glances, but it found its high water mark in Silas Croft. Croft was a man who had prospered in Prosperity Wells. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, held the note on the general store, and had a voice that was accustomed to filling any room he entered. He found her as she was counting the few coins she had left, trying to decide between a loaf of bread or a sack of oats. He stopped in front of her, his shadow falling over her like a blanket. "Well, well," he boomed, a wide, just unkind smile spreading across his face. If it ain't the newest land baron in the county. A few men loitering on the boardwalk chuckled. I hear you bought yourself a temple, missy. Ida said nothing, merely looking up at him, her expression unreadable. $4, Croft laughed, a loud, braying sound. I'd have paid you $4 to haul it away. You know what's in there, don't you? The ghost of every sick Chinaman that died in this valley. You bought yourself a plague house. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. Take some advice. Use that deed for kindling and walk away. Some doors are best left shut. He straightened up, satisfied, and walked away, his laughter echoing down the street. The silence he left behind was just as loud. Later, inside the general store, a different kind of warning came. As she paid for a small sack of flour and a box of matches, the proprietor, Mr. Finch, avoided her eyes. But from the back of the store, where he was sweeping, an old Chinese man watched her. He was frail, his back bent into a permanent question mark, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He had been in the valley as long as anyone could remember, a quiet fixture who unloaded freight and did odd jobs, speaking only when necessary. As Ida turned to leave, he stepped forward, his broom held still in his gnarled hands. He glanced at the deed peeking out from her sack. They say fever, he said, his voice a dry whisper like rustling leaves. Fever is quick, convenient. He paused, his dark eyes holding hers. Some ghosts are not spirits. They are debts. Before Ida could ask what he meant, he bowed his head slightly and retreated into the shadows of the storeroom. The words settled in her mind, strange and unsettling. Debts, not sickness. The final warning came from Albert Pike. He was a railroad surveyor, a quiet man with kind eyes and a face weathered by the sun. She had seen him around town, but they had never spoken. He found her sitting on a bench, staring at the useless key in her hand. He didn't mock her. He sat at the other end of the bench, as if giving her space. That was a brave thing you did, he said softly. Ida looked up, surprised. It was a foolish thing, she replied, her voice barely audible. Maybe, he conceded. Or maybe not. I just wanted to say, be careful. He looked out toward the east, in the direction of the temple. I've been surveying the lines out that way for the past year. I've seen that place 100 times. I've also seen the records back at the county office. He lowered his voice. The official story is fever, but the timeline doesn't make sense. The railroad had just laid a new spur line. There was a dispute over labor, over pay. Then suddenly, the whole Chinese camp is empty, and the temple is sealed. The dispute was gone, too. He looked at her directly. Croft was the foreman for that railroad crew. He got his land cheap right after. He stood up. The story about a fever is easier than the one about a fight. Just be careful what you go looking for. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Ida alone with 3 warnings, each one darker and more complex than the last. The key in her hand no longer felt just cold. It felt dangerous. That evening, as twilight settled, Ida made her way to the temple. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass. She carried her meager possessions in the flour sack slung over her shoulder. The sack of flour, the matches, a tin cup, and a threadbare blanket. The temple loomed before her, a dark shape against a sky full of stars. The heavy timber planks barring the doors were formidable, held in place by thick, hand-forged spikes that looked like they had been driven in with a sledgehammer. The rust-pitted key the auctioneer had given her was for the lock, but the lock was hidden behind the barricade. There would be no getting inside tonight. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, so profound it made her knees feel weak. She had nowhere else to go. This was her property, her shelter, even if she was on the wrong side of its walls. she walked around the building, her boots crunching on the dry, overgrown weeds. The side windows were boarded over just as securely as the front doors. At the back, a small, collapsed lean-to sagged against the wall, its roof a tangle of broken boards. There was no way in. Defeated, she returned to the front and sank down onto the wide porch steps. The wood was old and silvered, but it felt solid beneath her. She pulled her thin blanket around her shoulders, the fabric doing little to ward off the chill that was seeping up from the ground. The silence was absolute. Out here, there were no town sounds, only the vast, indifferent quiet of the plains. She was utterly alone. A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, then another. She didn't bother to wipe them away. What was the point? She had been so proud, she so defiant at the auction. Now, sitting in the dark in front of a building that was sealed like a coffin, she just felt like a fool. As she huddled there, a movement in the shadows caught her eye. Two yellow eyes blinked at her from the edge of the overgrown yard. A low growl rumbled in the dark. Ida froze, her heart pounding. A wolf? A coyote? The shape detached itself from the darkness and padded silently closer. It was a dog. A scruffy, medium-sized stray with matted fur and ribs showing plainly through its hide. It stopped a few feet away, head low, tail giving a tentative, uncertain wag. It looked as lost and lonely as she felt. She stayed perfectly still. The dog watched her for a long moment, then circled once and lay down at the other end of the porch, letting out a heavy sigh, as if it, too, had come to the end of a long and difficult road. Ida watched the slow rise and fall of its flank. She wasn't alone anymore. She closed her eyes, listening to the sound of the wind whispering around the eaves of the temple, a sound like a long, drawn-out secret. Sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it was the heavy, dreamless sleep of the utterly spent. The first light of dawn was a thin gray line on the horizon when Ida woke. She was stiff and cold, the blanket damp with dew. The stray dog was still there, sleeping at the far end of the porch, a dusty, motionless lump. It lifted its head as she sat up, watching her with weary intelligence. She had nothing to offer it, but its presence was a small comfort against the morning's vast emptiness. Her first task was the door. The iron key was useless as long as the planks were in place. She needed a pry bar, a crowbar, something with leverage. She had nothing. She walked the perimeter of the property, her eyes scanning the ground, hoping to find a discarded tool, a piece of metal, anything. All she found were weeds, rocks, and the detritus of a decade of neglect. As the sun climbed higher, casting a flat, unforgiving light on her predicament, she heard the rhythmic clopping of a horse. It was Albert Pike, riding out for his day's work surveying. He reined in his horse when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Whitcomb," he said, tipping his hat. "Looks like you have a bit of a predicament." Ida nodded, a faint blush of embarrassment on her cheeks. "The doors are nailed shut." "I see that," he said. He looked at the thick spikes, then back at her. "It'll take more than bare hands to get through those." He swung down from his horse. From a leather roll tied behind his saddle, he produced a long, heavy crowbar. "Let's see what we can do." He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply saw a problem and offered a solution. Together, they worked on the planks. The wood was old pine, and the spikes were sunk deep. Albert wedged the tip of the crowbar under the first plank and put his weight into it. The wood groaned in protest. Ida used a heavy rock to hammer the crowbar deeper. It was slow, arduous work. The screech of the nails pulling free was a piercing, ugly sound. With each one, Ida felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. She was breaking a seal, violating a warning. After nearly an hour of straining and sweating under the morning sun, the last plank came free with a loud crack and clattered onto the porch. Behind it was the door and the heavy, ornate iron lock. Albert tried the handle. It was frozen solid with rust. "Key won't work on that," he said, wiping his brow. "It's seized." He hefted the crowbar again. "Permission to break your lock, ma'am?" Ida hesitated for only a second. "Yes." He positioned the crowbar, and with two sharp, powerful blows, the iron housing of the lock shattered. The great door swung inward with a low groan, opening a rectangle of profound darkness. The air that billowed out was thick and stale, smelling of dust, decaying paper, and something else. Something faintly medicinal, like dried herbs. Albert stepped back. "My work is done," he said. "The rest is yours." He refused her offer of thanks, to simply nodding before mounting his horse and riding off. Ida stood at the threshold, peering into the gloom. She lit one of her precious matches. The flame flickered, then steadied, pushing back the darkness in a small, trembling circle. The interior was vast. Dust lay like a soft gray blanket over everything. Benches, a large central altar, intricate wooden carvings on the walls. But through the dust, she saw not chaos, but order. Cushions were neatly stacked on the benches. Scrolls were tidied away in alcoves. It did not look like a place abandoned in a panic. She stepped inside, the stray dog following at her heels. Her lantern cast dancing shadows. She ran a hand over the altar, a wide, flat table of dark, polished wood. And there she saw it, the first clue. In the thick, undisturbed layer of dust that covered the entire surface, there was a single, perfect circle, about the size of a teacup, a clean spot. The wood inside the circle was dark and clear, as if an object had been resting there for 10 years and had only recently been lifted away. But that was impossible. No one had been inside. The doors had been sealed. She touched the clean spot. The wood felt cool. It was a detail that didn't fit, a note of dissonance in the silent, dusty room. Something was wrong with the story. Ida spent the rest of that day letting the light and air into the temple. She and Albert had broken the seal on the front doors, but the windows were still boarded tight. Lacking a crowbar of her own, she used the claw end of a broken hammer she found in the collapsed lean-to, working patiently at the nails on one of the large side windows. The boards came away with the same groaning reluctance as the ones on the door, and when the last one fell, sunlight streamed into the dusty space, cutting golden shafts through the gloom. For the first time, she could truly see what she had bought. The room was long and high-ceilinged. Intricate, unpainted wooden carvings of dragons and birds decorated the beams. Along the walls were long benches, and at the far end stood the altar she had seen by lantern light. It was a place of worship, that was clear, but it felt like more. There were shelves filled with clay jars and paper-wrapped parcels, and alcoves that held not icons, but books and scrolls. It felt like a library, a school, a community hall, all in one. It felt lived in, even under its decade-thick shroud of dust. She found a broom with a worn but still functional one head and began to sweep. The work was simple, physical, and deeply satisfying. With each stroke, she was not just clearing away dirt, she was peeling back time. The stray dog, whom she had decided to call Dust, lay in a patch of sun near the open door, watching her with half-closed eyes. He seemed to have appointed himself the guardian of the threshold, a silent, furry companion to her solitary labor. As she swept, her mind turned over the clean circle on the altar. It was a persistent, nagging anomaly. How could a spot be clean when everything around it was buried in dust? Had someone been inside? If so, how and why? It suggested a recent presence, a secret visitor. Her work uncovered more inconsistencies. Near the back wall, she found a stack of neatly folded blankets, clean and ready for use, stored inside a wooden chest. Lots in another corner, she uncovered crates filled with dried herbs, roots, and bottled tinctures, all meticulously labeled in both English and Chinese characters. These weren't the belongings of people fleeing a plague. These were the well-managed stores of a clinic or an apothecary. This place hadn't just been a temple, it had been a place of healing. The town's story of a fever now seemed even more hollow. If there had been a terrible sickness, wouldn't these medicines have been used, scattered, depleted? Instead, they were packed away as if in preparation for a long winter. The image of a community preparing for a siege began to form in her mind, replacing the one of panicked victims. This was a place that had been getting ready for something, not running from it. The labor was hard on her body, which was accustomed to the repetitive motions of laundry, not the heavy work of hauling and scrubbing. By late afternoon, her back ached and her hands were raw. She stopped to rest, sitting on one of the benches she had cleared. Dust patted over and rested his head on her knee, a gesture of simple, uncomplicated fellowship. She stroked his matted fur, her gaze sweeping over the slowly transforming room. The sun, now slanting low through the newly opened window, illuminated a row of small, worn shoes tucked neatly under another bench. Children's shoes. The sight sent a pang through her chest. They weren't tossed aside. They were placed there carefully, side by side, as if their owners intended to come right back for them. The temple was full of these small, quiet testaments to an orderly life, interrupted. She went back to her work, a new sense of purpose driving her. She was no longer just cleaning a derelict building. She was bearing witness. As she swept around the main altar, her broom snagged on something. She bent down to look. One of the wide floorboards right at the foot of the altar was slightly raised along one edge. It wasn't much, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to catch the bristles of the broom. She tried to press it down with her foot, but it was solid. Curious, she knelt, her fingers tracing the edge. It felt loose. She worked her fingertips into the crack and pulled. The board resisted, then shifted with a low groan. Ida's heart began to beat a little faster. The loose floorboard felt like a secret wanting to be told. She set the broom aside and knelt on the dusty floor, her fingers probing the edges of the plank. It was cut differently from the others, the seams more deliberate. Using the broken hammer's claw, she wedged it into the crack and gently pried. The wood groaned, but it gave way. With a final pull, the board came up in her hands, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity beneath. The space wasn't just a gap between joists. It had been intentionally hollowed out and lined with thick black oilcloth to keep out the damp. And nestled inside, fitting the space perfectly, was a metal box. It was a simple cash box, the kind a merchant might use, about the size of a loaf of bread, its black paint chipped and worn. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Treasure. The thought was immediate and overwhelming. Had she stumbled upon the hidden savings of the temple's builders? A fortune sealed away from the world? Her hands trembled as she reached into the dark space and lifted the box out. It was heavy, solid. She expected it to be locked, to present another barrier, another challenge. But when she tested the latch, it clicked open easily. It hadn't been locked at all. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dry ink, and slowly lifted the lid. There was no glint of gold, no hoard of silver coins. The box was filled with paper. It was packed with thin, leather-bound ledgers and stacks of receipts tied with string. A profound disappointment washed over her, sharp and bitter. It was just paperwork, worthless. She almost closed the lid, her grand discovery dissolving into nothing more than a pile of old accounts. But the words of the old Chinese man echoed in her mind. Some ghosts are not spirits. They are debts. She picked up the topmost ledger. It was written in a neat, careful hand, the columns precise. The entries were in a mix of English and Chinese characters. She could read the English parts. Silas Croft, 200 feet lumber, $16, unpaid. Miller's livery, hire of 2 wagons, $5, unpaid. Prosperity General Store, 5 sacks rice, paid. On and on it went, a meticulous record of the economic life of the Chinese community. It was a ledger of debts, both paid and, more often, unpaid. She leafed through page after page, recognizing the names of the most prominent men in Prosperity Wells. Croft's name appeared most frequently, his debts the largest. This wasn't just an account book. It was a shadow history of the town, written from the perspective of the people everyone else had tried to forget. Tucked in the very bottom of the box, each wrapped in a separate piece of oilcloth, was one last book. It was smaller than the others, a personal journal. The script was the same, but the tone was different. The first entries were hopeful, describing the building of the temple, the birth of children, the planting of a garden. But as the pages turned, the entries grew darker. They described threats from railroad foremen, disputes over wages, small acts of violence that went unpunished. The last entry was dated 10 years ago in the fall. The ink was slightly blurred, the handwriting rushed. They are coming. Croft's men, with torches. They say it is fever to scare the town. It is not fever. It is a clearing of accounts. We have hidden the books. We have hidden the children in the cellar beneath the kitchen. May Kuan Yin forgive us and protect them. A cold dread washed over Ida, and it wasn't a massacre. It was an execution, an act of violent, calculated greed disguised as a public health crisis. She now understood the nailed doors, the convenient story, Croft's pointed warnings. The temple wasn't a tomb for the dead. It was a vault for the evidence. And she had just opened it. The sky, which had been a clear, bright blue all day, began to bruise with gray clouds by late afternoon. A cool, damp wind swept in from the east, rattling the newly uncovered window panes and carrying the scent of rain. The journal lay open on Ida's lap, its final, terrible words seeming to burn in the fading light. A cellar beneath the kitchen. The collapsed lean-to at the back must have been the kitchen. She had to see. She grabbed her lantern and hurried out the back, dust trotting anxiously at her heels. The lean-to was a wreck. The roof caved in. The walls splintered. But under the debris, she could make out the shape of a large iron stove and a stone hearth. The floor was a mess of broken boards and packed earth. She began to clear a space, her hands raw, her mind racing. Where would a cellar door be? After 10 minutes of frantic searching, she found it. A thick iron ring, almost completely buried in the dirt. She dug around it with her fingers and pulled with all her might. It was impossibly heavy. As she struggled, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the temple. The storm was coming fast. Just as she was about to give up, she heard a shout over the wind. "Hello? Anybody there?" A man's voice, strained with panic. Ida looked up to see a wagon on the road, its one wheel splintered and sunk deep into the mud that was quickly forming. A man, a woman, and 2 small children were huddled beside it, exposed to the driving rain. They were strangers, travelers caught by the sudden storm. Ida didn't hesitate. Her own desperate search could wait. "In here!" she yelled, waving them toward the temple. "Hurry!" They scrambled toward the shelter of the porch, the man carrying the younger child, the woman guiding the other. They were soaked and shivering. "Our axle broke," the man said, his teeth chattering. "We saw your light." "Come inside," Ida said, leading them into the dry, cavernous space of the temple. The woman looked around, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "What is this place?" she asked. "It's a shelter," Ida replied simply. She led them to the corner where she had found the clean blankets, handing them out. She used some of the splintered boards from the lean-to to build a small, cautious fire in the stone hearth at the back, the smoke finding its way out through a crack in the roof. The small flame pushed back the damp and the dark, creating a small island of warmth and light. The family's little girl had a racking cough. Remembering the crates of medicine, Ida found a jar of honey and licorice root tincture. She mixed a spoonful with warm water in her tin cup and gave it to the child, who drank it gratefully. The family looked at her with awe. They were strangers, and she, a stranger herself, had given them warmth, shelter, and medicine. As the storm raged outside, a different kind of threat appeared. A horseman rode up to the temple, Tita, a dark figure against the lightning-streaked sky. It was Silas Croft. He dismounted and strode onto the porch, his face a mask of thunder. "What do you think you're doing?" he bellowed, his voice carrying over the storm. He saw the family huddled by the fire, the light in the window. "I told you to leave this place be. I told you it was cursed." Ida rose and walked to the open doorway, positioning herself between him and the family she was protecting. She was trembling, but she stood her ground. "It's raining," she said, her voice quiet but firm. They needed shelter. Croft's eyes narrowed, searching her face in the flickering lantern light. He was looking for fear, for compliance. He saw none. He saw a woman who had drawn a line in the dirt. He saw the open ledgers on the bench behind her. His face went pale. "Cha, you are making a terrible mistake," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. He pointed a finger at her. "There are things buried here that need to stay buried." He held her gaze for a long, charged moment, then turned without another word, mounted his horse, and galloped away into the storm. Ida stayed in the doorway until he was gone, her heart pounding like a drum. The choice had been made for her. She was no longer just a caretaker of a building. She was the guardian of its truth. The storm broke before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. The family, whose name was Miller, was full of gratitude. The father, a blacksmith by trade, insisted on helping Ida with the cellar door before they left. His strength, combined with hers, was enough. The heavy wooden door lifted, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into darkness. "Thank you," Ida said, her voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Miller pressed a small carved bird into her hand. "No," she said softly. "Thank you. You gave us sanctuary." As they rigged a repair for their wagon and prepared to limp on to the next town, they promised to tell everyone of the kindness they had found in the old temple. When they were gone, Ida lit her lantern and descended the steps. The air in the cellar was cool and dry. It was small, no more than 10 feet square with stone walls. In the center of the room were several small cots, and on them neatly folded blankets. It was a hiding place, but it was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no forgotten belongings. A wave of relief and sorrow washed over her. The children had been hidden here, but they hadn't been found here. What had become of them? Had they escaped? Tucked into a crevice between 2 stones in the wall, she found one last thing: a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were several dozen letters, written in Chinese, and a single daguerreotype. It was a portrait of a smiling man and woman, surrounded by a group of about 15 people, including several children, standing proudly in front of the newly built temple. It was the face of the community that had been erased. Ida knew she couldn't keep this discovery to herself. The ledgers, the journal, the letters, they were too important. The next morning, she wrapped the books and the photograph carefully in oilcloth and walked into town. She went straight to the county surveyor's office, a small, dusty room filled with maps and charts. Albert Pike was there, Susan poring over a topographical survey. He looked up as she entered. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, a question in his eyes. Without a word, she unwrapped the bundle and laid the ledgers on his desk. She opened the journal to the last, terrible entry. He read it, his face growing grim. He picked up the ledgers, his surveyor's eye for detail recognizing the meticulous nature of the records. These are proof," he murmured, looking from the books to her face. "Croft's warning," Ida said. "It wasn't about a curse." "No," Albert replied, his voice low. "It was a threat." Together they went to the county courthouse to see the clerk, a small, balding man named Mr. Abernathy, who had a reputation for being quiet and scrupulously honest. He listened to their story patiently, his fingers steepled under his chin. He examined the ledgers, his brow furrowed in concentration. He recognized the names. He recognized the debts. He cross-referenced one of Croft's unpaid entries with a deed transfer record from the same year. "The debt for the lumber," Abernathy said softly, "was for the construction of Croft's first barn. According to this, he acquired the land for that barn 1 week after the temple was officially sealed. The previous owner was a Mr. Chen." He looked up, his mild eyes now hard as stone. "This isn't just a journal, Miss Whitcomb. This is corroborating evidence." Word began to spread, not like a wildfire, but like a slow-seeping water. It started with the Millers, who told the story of the kind woman in the old Joss house who gave them shelter. Then the whispers started about the ledgers. The townspeople who had mocked Ida now watched her with a new, uncertain respect. They saw her walking to the store, Dust trotting faithfully by her side, and they no longer saw a fool. They saw a woman who had unearthed a secret they had all tacitly agreed to bury. The chorus of laughter turned to a chorus of murmurs, then to a watchful silence. Silas Croft felt the change immediately. Men who had once sought his favor now avoided his gaze. Business partners became scarce. The power he had wielded through wealth and intimidation began to evaporate, replaced by the silent, collective judgment of the community. No charges were filed. The crime was a decade old, the witnesses gone, the proof circumstantial. But justice came in another form. Croft was not ruined financially, but his name was. He was humbled, not by a court of law, but by the quiet court of public memory, and reawakened by one woman and a box of old books. People began to leave things on the temple steps. A woman left a jar of apple butter. A farmer left a sack of potatoes. A carpenter, hearing the roof leaked, left a small stack of new shingles and a bag of nails. They were small gestures, offerings of apology and respect. Ida Whitcomb was no longer the town outcast. She had become the town's conscience. The last light of a late autumn afternoon spilled across the valley, turning the dry grass to gold. The air was crisp and clean. Ida sat on the steps of the temple, her hands resting on her knees. The building behind her was no longer a place of dread. The windows were clean, the porch was swept, and the roof was patched with a quilt of mismatched but solid shingles. Beside the porch, a small patch of earth had been cleared and turned, shatu ready for a spring garden. The stray dog, Dust, lay at her feet, his head on his paws, breathing the slow, even breaths of a creature at peace. The temple was quiet, but it was a living quiet now, the silence of sanctuary, not of a tomb. Albert Pike walked up the path, his footsteps soft on the dirt. He stopped before the steps, holding his hat in his hands. He had been a steady presence in the weeks since the discovery, helping her translate parts of the letters, bringing her news from town, offering the simple gift of his quiet company. "It's starting to look like a home," he said, his gaze taking in the repaired roof and the clean-swept yard. Ida nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "It's a peaceful place," she said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the western ridge. The town of Prosperity Wells was a distant smudge in the twilight, its lights just beginning to flicker on. "The last of the letters," Albert said softly. "I finished translating them. The children from the cellar, they made it out. The journal writer, a man named Lee, got them away through a tunnel that led to the creek. The letters were from them, sent to a cousin in San Francisco, telling him they were safe." A weight Ida hadn't even realized she was carrying lifted from her shoulders. The story finally had its end. Not a happy one, but a complete one. The ghosts were finally at rest. "What will you do now?" Albert asked. "The town council has offered to buy the property back from you, for a fair price this time." Ida looked out at the vast, open land before her. She thought of the $4, the mocking laughter, the cold night on the porch. She thought of the neat rows of shoes, the jars of medicine, the heavy, truth-filled ledgers. She had bought a building, but she had found a purpose. She had uncovered a crime, but she had restored a memory. Her gaze fell upon the sturdy, repaired walls of the temple, a place built by hopeful hands, sealed by guilty ones, and reopened by her own. Albert waited, watching her face in the gloaming. "They built a temple," Ida said, her voice quiet but clear in the still air. "I suppose I just kept it from becoming a tomb." She would stay. This place was more than property. It was a trust she had earned. Thank you for staying with us to the end of Ida's journey. Her story reminds us that true value often lies in the courage to look closer at the things a world has chosen to discard. If you were moved by her quiet determination, please consider leaving a like and a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and the remarkable people who uncover it. We'll see you in the next story.